The Conquer Worry Show, episode number 22. Welcome to the Conquer Worry Show, the show dedicated to helping people who struggle with their minds. If you are looking for stories of resilience, if you are looking for inspiration, or you simply want to conquer worry, this is the show for you.
Welcome to another episode of the Conquer Worry Show. I'm your host, Jay Coulter, and today I'm excited to have Hakeem Rahim on the show. Now, Hakeem earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from Harvard University and also holds dual master's degrees from the Teachers College at Columbia University. In 2012, Hakeem began speaking openly about his 14-year journey with bipolar disorder. Since then, he has testified in front of the U.S. Congress, been featured in the USA Today, and shared his journey with almost 6,000 college, high school, and middle school students. Hakeem is also a certified National Alliance of Mental Illness speaker, as well as a member of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance's National Board. Hakeem, welcome to the show. We're glad you could join us.
Thank you so much, Dave. Happy to be here.
Now, before we get started, our listeners would like to get to know a little bit about you. Take a few minutes and tell us about yourself, and specifically things we couldn't find from a simple Google search.
Sure. So the first thing I like to say, my family's from the islands, Trinidad and Grenada, so I'm a Caribbean American guy. I actually am vegan. Speaking of thinking about Caribbean food, I actually am a vegan, part of my diet. And I'll share with you why I've chosen and selected that style of eating a little bit later. And I also was a cheerleader in college, so I don't think that would show up, but it was a big part of my college experience. And I always tell people that FDR was also a cheerleader at Harvard, so, don't make too much fun. Greatness comes out of pom-poms. So also, do spoken word poetry. I record, I write poetry, and just really excited to be here and share some of my life experiences with your listeners.
That's great. That is definitely diverse experiences. Tell me about the cheerleading. What sport were you cheering for?
So the reason why I started cheerleading, I wasn't a cheerleader in high school. I wrestled. I played soccer in high school, and one day I walked into the gym as a bright-eyed freshman, and I walked into the gym, and this guy walks around from the back of his desk and the front of the gym. He says, "You look like you need to be a cheerleader." I walked by him. The next day he asked me again. This third time I went out for the cheerleading squad, and I ended up doing it for 2.5 years, and it was a great experience. We cheered for basketball, we cheered for football, men's and women's basketball, and it was just a phenomenal experience. And I always tell students, just try different things in college, that will affect you positively, and you never know what stories you will come out with it with.
That's great. All right, Hakeem, we like to bookend our shows with our flagship questions. A little bit later, we'll talk about finding your purpose, but let's start with worry. Our listeners would love to know, before we get started hearing about your journey, how do you personally conquer worry?
Sure. Me personally, in conquering worry, first, two things I like to say. How you live is about mindset and how you cope with the things that you go through in life. So let me start with mindset. For me, mindset not only means spirituality, how you think about the everyday. I'm very big with spirituality, and one of my favorite lines is, "This too shall pass." So whether it's a depressive episode or a moment of angst or anxiety, knowing that line and knowing that sense of comfort that it's more than the here and now, this too shall pass, it's very helpful. So that's a big part of my mindset. And also training myself. It's important to train your thoughts. So I do a lot of listening to whether it be Wayne Dyer or Deepak Chopra or a lot of positive psychology books. And not only that, but positive thinking strategies. So that's important. And then knowing that this too shall pass is very important. Those are two big things. And I believe I mentioned something else, but I just want to really stick and focus with the spirituality and mindset. How do you think about what you're going through, and knowing that what you're going through is only temporary?
So mindset and some positive psychology. I like it.
Yeah, and spirituality. And spirituality is a broader component than just positive psychology. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, everybody has struggled with some form of worry at some time in their life. You know, some folks have had the struggles that you and I have had, yours with bipolar, mine with depression. Other folks have just had some particularly challenging times. Can you take our listeners to a point in time that was particularly low for you? Tell us what was going on, and then tell us how you got out of that hole.
Sure. So as you said that, what was a trying experience? I'll tell you this. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the end of my junior year in college back in 2000. End of my sophomore year back in college in the year 2000. I was hospitalized for 2 weeks. That was coming off of a long stretch of a manic episode, meaning I wasn't sleeping. I reduced my eating. I was having visions of Jesus and snakes and demons. It was an interesting, fun experience, but then when you can't stop yourself from thinking, nor can you fall asleep, it becomes a really heart-wrenching and worrying experience, even in the moment. But fast forward after my diagnosis and hospitalization, I went back to my school, went back to Harvard the same fall that after I was diagnosed that summer. And that was probably one of the most difficult times in my life. I remember being curled up on my dorm room floor as a 19-year-old newly diagnosed, just taking medication, having severe side effects from weight gain to cognitive slowdown. And that was a difficult time. How do you deal with this, being away from home, being newly diagnosed, having anxiety, feeling like you're going to jump out of your skin, feeling like your couch is a coffin, like I say in my poetry? How do you get through that? And that was probably the lowest point in my life, thinking about my context around diagnosis. And getting out of that, I mean, part of it was really, again, spirituality. Another part of it was leaning on family, making new friends, and strengthening the relationships with friends that I did have. And again, just knowing the sense that this too shall pass. This is not all. And I'm so big in that belief and sharing that belief again with anybody, including your listeners.
So today, do you use those same tools to manage your bipolar, or do you have a different process?
I use the same tools, and I have been able to add on to the tool belt. So what I talk about managing bipolar disorder, two things. One, practical lessons I've learned, and two, conceptual lessons. The practical lessons for me include coping skills, treatment, and acceptance. Those are three big things for me. Treatment, what I mean by that is taking medication. I still take low doses of medication. I see my psychiatrist, psychologist. Therapy is important. Medication is important for me. I choose to take medication. My coping skills include diet. Again, I said I'm vegan. That whatever you put in your body is what you get out. Exercise is important. Can decrease anxiety, decrease depression. That's important, part of my tool belt. And again, meditation, yoga, types of music that you listen to, and all these things are part of my tool belt, along with knowing that I actually do have a condition that I need to manage in my life. So those things, acceptance, treatment, coping skills, are huge parts of my tool belt and the toolkit that I use to manage living with bipolar disorder.
Let's talk about acceptance for a minute. So I've always thought that the first step to getting better once you realize you're sick is getting professional medical help, but the very next step is to actually accept that you're sick. And that was the biggest problem I had. How do you do that?
Well, first, I speak at a lot of family groups, and Jay, I thank you for honing in on this particular question, acceptance. I really wish I had the silver bullet. I really wish I had the pill that you could give somebody to take and say, hey, take this pill and you will know that there is something wrong. The fact of the matter is, it's hard for anybody to really, at a very core level, accept that something's wrong. There's something wrong with me. And I was very lucky that early on, as soon as I was diagnosed, part of me instinctively accepted that there was something wrong, whether it be because I was a Harvard University student and a valedictorian of my high school, and now I was at a psychiatric ward. Maybe that clicked it or triggered it. Maybe it was the psychiatric nurse on the ward that told me not to come back, not because he didn't believe in who I was, but because he believed in who I was. He said that you are so valuable, I don't want to see you here ever again. Maybe those couple of incidents or episodes really helped me understand that there was something wrong with me, or wrong through my condition, but not wrong with me. And I think that's a big distinction. How do you accept that there's something wrong, not with you, who you are, but a condition that you're dealing with? And I think that's such a huge distinction. Sometimes we're made to feel that there's something wrong with us versus a condition that we have to deal with in our lives. And I think that's huge. And you're so right, Jay. How we think about what we're dealing with is, I believe, even more important of how we treat what we're dealing with.
Yeah, in my experience, when the doctor suggested that I might have depression and I should look into it during my initial consultation, I said in the third person, Jay Coulter doesn't get depressed, and I walked out of his office.
Yeah.
You know, in hindsight now looking at that was the attitude and mindset I had at the time. Obviously, the doctor was right, and getting to acceptance for that was kind of hard. But I tell you, this really leads into something that I want to dig deep on with you, and that's stigma. And given that there is so much stigma around mental illness today, what made you decide to come out and speak openly about your struggles?
Sure. The main thing that I decided to speak openly is a word that it may sound overused, but it's so true for me, is authenticity. I was an academic advisor for about 5 years after studying psychology in undergraduate studies, studying graduate work at Teachers College, psychological counseling, and doing a life coaching certification. And I was sitting across from my students who I was advising, and I was telling them, I was asking them, share with me what you want to do with your lives. Let me help you by hearing your stories. And as I sat in my office, it was nothing wrong with my job. I loved working with my students. But as I sat in there, I said, I'm not being true to myself. I have an illness or condition, a life condition that I'm going through, and I feel that I have to hide. I never told any of my employers. Some of my closest family and friends didn't know. I said, I shouldn't have to hide. I'm asking people to tell their story. I've studied psychology to help others. How can I live with not even sharing my story to myself and to my closest family? So for me to be authentic, I said, I want to talk about my experience. Not everybody has to do that to give them their sense of authenticity, but for me, being in line with what I studied in life, what I believed in life, and what I was doing and saying in life was so key for me. And I believe that in this 2-year journey, going from sitting with students in my office in Manhattan to speaking in front of Congress 2 years later, because I took a leap of faith and saying, you know what, despite what people think about mental illness, I'm going to share my story. I think that is a powerful journey to go from affecting the lives of wonderful students to potentially the lives of millions of people.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your opportunity speaking in front of Congress. What did you talk about? How'd you get the invitation?
Sure. So one of my friends who actually works on Capitol Hill, she actually saw an article that I wrote for the Harvard Black Alumni newsletter. One of my friends, unfortunately, died by suicide this past February. We were 2 black men, African-American men, on Harvard campus at the same time, both struggling with mental illness, but neither of us talked about it. We were good friends at the time when we were undergrads. And that's a question, that's a concern for me. How can two people of similar backgrounds, similar paths, not even talk about what they're both struggling with? And that was an issue. So his passing really struck a chord with me. So I wrote an open letter in the Black Alumni newsletter for Harvard, and my friend saw it. She worked on Capitol Hill. She said that, hey, listen, we need a person who's an advocate, who has lived experience, has a strong voice, and you may have an opportunity to speak, and I'll let you know. She called me back 3 weeks later. She said, we need somebody, and hopefully it can be you. I said, you know what? This is my time to step up and share my story. There is no hiding when hopefully you can serve, and service is important. This is about service for me.
I love it. I love that attitude. And Hakeem, given all that, what do you hope to accomplish?
For me is very simple. Mental illness is a life condition like any other. Mental illness is not a disability. It's not an abnormality. It's not something that makes you violent, or it's not something that you're crazy. Mental illness is a life condition, and I believe when we make it acceptable to talk about what we're dealing with, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, we will no longer feel like mental illness is something abnormal and foreign. Mental illness is a life condition. You have trust issues, you have diabetes. Oh, those are your struggles in life? Well, hey, I have bipolar disorder, and here's how I manage it. Oh, that's how you manage yours? Well, here's what I do for myself. And I think when we change the conversation from mental illness being something stigmatized where you have to hide in silence and potentially have dire consequences, suicide, loss of job, loss of life, either your own or somebody else's, when we have that conversation that mental illness is not something foreign, it is part of a human condition, and it's a human condition that we can live with and treat successfully, I think then part of my goal in life will have been succeeded.
I'm a big fan of that goal, Hakeem. That's great.
Thank you. So they said, I was taking a course one day, it said, we all have problems. It's just what size problems we decide to take on. We can have petty problems and work on them our whole life, or we can take on big ones and forget about the little things that we worry about.
I love it. So, Hakeem, you've spoken to almost 6,000 students at multiple colleges, high schools, middle schools. Why is this avenue so important to you?
This avenue is so important for me because my first few weeks in the school, 3 weeks into being on Harvard's campus, I had a major panic attack. I had no words to describe what was happening to me. All I knew was that I was in my room by myself. All my friends were out socializing, having fun in the first few weeks of campus and school, and I was hiding underneath my covers. I said to myself, if I could educate some kid or some child or some young adult that they could know what could put a label to what they were going through, or could see a friend and know what they are going through, what their friend is going through in order to help them get help, I know that's like me reaching back into my past and saying, hey, listen, Hakeem, this is what anxiety is. Or one of my friends knowing, Hakeem, this is what you're experiencing. I may have gotten treatment a lot earlier than it took me 2 years later, 2.5 years later, for my first experience with mental illness. So for me, this is like me going back and speaking to my 15-year-old, 17-year-old self and saying, hey, listen, this is this education that may help you or somebody else, and that's why I'm so passionate about this. Plus, this is a generation that will change what mental illness means in living with mental illness means. They will see mental illness as not as a disability, but a condition that we can live with, and we have to start the conversation with them.
That's great. So, Hakeem, if somebody is struggling today, the listener who feels they may be struggling with anxiety or depression, or maybe they just received a bipolar diagnosis, what would you say to them?
Sure. One of the things I say in my talks is that, and I believe wholeheartedly, that your diagnosis is not a death sentence. Your diagnosis is not a death sentence. Your diagnosis can potentially be the beginning of a healing process. Going from diagnosis to wellness is a big arc that I talk about. How do you go from being diagnosed and maybe potentially a very low point, although other low points may come, but how do you go from that arc of diagnosis to wellness? And that's part of what I talk about the loved one, the people living with mental illness. Let's go on this journey of getting from where you're diagnosed to getting to a place of wellness. And I would say to anybody who's out there struggling, maybe need to get a diagnosis or have a diagnosis, that your diagnosis is not the end. It could potentially be the beginning of healing and leading a life that you want to lead.
That's great advice. Hakeem, how could our listeners find out a little bit more about you and your services?
Sure. Again, I do, most of the speaking I do now, I do speak to clergy, law enforcement, teachers, social workers, but really a lot of my main passion is speaking in schools, high schools, middle schools, colleges. They can find me on the web if they Google my name, Hakeem Rahim, and they can see on btslessonplans.org. They can find me on HakeemRahim.com. All those places, and you can see a lot of the work that I've been doing in schools, and you'll see why I'm passionate about what I do, and you'll see the impact that I'm having. So just give a Google. Hakeem Rahim, as you said, Jay, is a pretty unique name, and you'll find me.
That's great. And we'll also have links to all of that in the show notes to this episode. So, Hakeem, now we're at our other anchor question on the Conquer Worry Show, and it has to do with life's purpose. We are convinced that knowing your life's purpose lays the foundation for overcoming a lot of worries in life. But experience and research has also shown us that about only 5% of folks know what their purpose is. What is your life's purpose? And how would you suggest somebody who doesn't know what their purpose is in life go out and find it?
Sure. So, and this is a great question. I think this is an awesome question, period. So for me, my life purpose is to use my gifts, skills, and talents to help others speak with their authentic voice. And how I came about determining my life purpose is through purpose exercises. Through my coaching course that I did, I believe that everything we go through, we are doing it ultimately to reconcile what we've been through ourselves. So part of that, for me, why I say that is because going through that coaching course, I really was looking for why I went through what I went through. And through the coaching course, I got some exercises. One of the exercises I would share with the listeners is break your life up into chunks. If you are 30, break it up into 5-year intervals. Look at each interval in your life. Where during that 5-year interval have you felt most on purpose, where you've lost yourself in something that you've been doing, that you lost time, you lost track of time, you lost who you were? That's a clue to what your life purpose is. Break that up into 5-year chunks. Look at that and explain, once you've done that, explain why this thing that you narrowed in on, why was it so meaningful to you? Then once you do that, then you can narrow those themes down within them, and then that can start to give you clues as to what you were really here for. We are all here for purpose, and I believe it's some of us have tapped into it, some of us have not, and some of us have come close to it, but it's just taking that extra step past worry, conquering your worry, conquering your fear, and just stepping into your authentic self. And I believe I had fortunate enough to, one, have the support from family and friends to be able to step into my authentic self. Again, nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing can happen by itself. We all need support. And I think that once we can sense what our purpose is and then conquer that worry, conquer that fear, and go for it and have that support and know that we're confident that the universe conspires for our success, like Paulo Coelho says, then nothing can stop us. And everybody will be lined up to be on your show, Jay, because we've all conquered some form of worry in our lives.
I really like that concept of the 5-year purposes. Of all the guests we've had on, nobody has articulated such a crisp plan for determining your own purpose. I really like that, Hakeem. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You're doing great work. And like I told you in our pre-interview conversation, the world needs more folks like you that are out there telling their story of struggle, telling their story of recovery, and all that's going to do is encourage more people who need help to go out and get help. I hope you come back on the show and join us again sometime.
Would be my pleasure, James. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Conquer Worry Show. For additional resources, please please visit us at conquerworry.org. We can also be found on social media. Connect with us on Twitter at twitter.com/conquerworry or on Facebook at facebook.com/conquerworry. And new episodes can be found on YouTube at youtube.com/conquerworryshow.